My name is Henry, and I'm 24 years old. If you had asked me 2 years ago what I thought about Christmas, I would have told you it was my favorite time of year. Back then, it meant warmth, laughter, and maybe even a little magic. At least, that's how I wanted to believe it. But last year, everything changed. Christmas turned into the moment I realized that to my family, I was invisible. Or worse, I was expendable. That evening still plays in my head like a loop I can't turn off. The living room smelled like pine needles and cinnamon candles. The tree sparkled with ornaments that had been in our family since before I was born. My mom was fussing with the garland, my dad had his camera out, and my younger sister Emily, 2 years younger than me, but always treated like the golden child, was sitting in the middle of the floor, bouncing with excitement as everyone piled presents around her. Me? I was sitting off to the side, legs crossed, trying to ignore the growing pit in my stomach. I thought maybe they'd forgotten me in the rush, or maybe the gifts had been stacked in a way that just made it look like they were all hers. But then, when everything was unwrapped and Emily was surrounded by clothes, electronics, and jewelry, my mom turned toward me with this casual little shrug and said, "Henry, you didn't really earn anything this year." The words sliced through me like ice. My dad chimed in, smiling. "Maybe next year if you work harder, huh?" And then they both went back to laughing with Emily, who was already showing off her new phone. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't even ask why. I just sat there with my hands folded in my lap, my heart pounding so hard I thought the sound might give me away. Inside, though, I was unraveling. Because here's the thing, they knew I'd been working. They knew I was holding down a part-time job while finishing my degree. They knew how exhausted I was trying to make something of myself without asking them for help. But none of that mattered. It wasn't about effort. It was about favoritism, the kind that had been quietly eating away at me since childhood. Emily had always been the center of their universe. She was the talented one, the future success. I was the afterthought, the one who never quite lived up to their standards. And now, in the glow of those twinkling Christmas lights, they weren't even bothering to hide it anymore. I laughed a little to myself, not because anything was funny, but because I realized in that moment that I was done. Done waiting for their approval. Done trying to prove I was worthy of love or attention. That night, when everyone had gone to bed, I dragged out my old suitcase and quietly packed it. No dramatic goodbye, no scene, just the silent decision to disappear. I remember standing in the doorway of my childhood bedroom, the walls still plastered with old posters, the bookshelf lined with trophies and ribbons no one had cared about in years. It should have felt like I was abandoning something important. Instead, it felt like I was shedding dead weight. As I zipped up the suitcase, I promised myself one thing. If I left, I wouldn't come back the same person. I wouldn't crawl back for scraps of affection or validation. If I ever crossed paths with them again, it would be on my terms. What I didn't know then was how quickly life can change when you stop waiting for others to give you permission to live it. And that's where my story really begins. Because 1 year later, as my family once again gathered around the Christmas tree, sipping cocoa and unwrapping gifts meant only for Emily, the television in the corner flickered to life with a breaking news segment. And there I was, sitting under studio lights, smiling into the camera. But before I get to that night, I need to explain how everything between those two Christmases unfolded. Every wound that pushed me further away, every moment that fueled my determination, and every step that brought me closer to the spotlight they never thought I'd reach. When I walked out of that house on Christmas night, suitcase rolling quietly behind me, I expected a text, a call, maybe even someone coming out to stop me. But nothing came. No footsteps on the porch, no phone buzzing in my pocket. The silence was its own confirmation. My absence didn't matter to them. The weeks that followed were colder than I could have imagined, not just because it was January in my city, but because the realization of what had happened settled deeper with every day. I rented a small room in a rundown house with peeling paint and a draft that crept in through the windows. My part-time job barely covered rent and groceries, and I picked up extra shifts wherever I could. I thought maybe the family would reach out. Maybe they'd wonder why I hadn't been home for Sunday dinners or Emily's little family game nights. But nothing. Instead, what I got were photos sent by mistake to the family group chat. Pictures of Emily at expensive restaurants, Emily with new clothes, Emily grinning with my parents at some weekend getaway. My mom would write captions like, "So proud of you, sweetheart," and "You deserve the world." I'd stare at those pictures on my cracked phone screen and wonder if they remembered they had another child at all. Then came the first real blow. A few months after I'd left, I learned through mutual friends that my parents had told everyone in our extended family that I couldn't handle responsibility and had decided to run away instead of growing up. They painted it as though they had tried to help me, but I'd rejected them. One aunt even called me to scold me for making things harder on your poor parents, saying, "Do you realize how much they've done for Emily? They can't be expected to carry you too." That call left me shaking with anger. Carry me? They hadn't carried me a single day of my life. I'd scraped my way through school, through jobs, through nights of wondering how to stretch a dollar. And yet, they managed to turn the narrative so I looked like the ungrateful failure while Emily shined as their perfect daughter. I tried to push through, but the favoritism didn't stop haunting me. Emily herself reached out once, if you can even call it that. It was late spring, and I got a text from her saying, "Hey, Mom and Dad said you're still struggling. Can you come by and mow the lawn? I can pay you $20. I read that message over and over, trying to process it. My sister, who had just gotten a brand new car for her birthday, was offering me $20 like I was a handyman. Not a brother, not family, just someone to clean up after them. I didn't respond, but she followed up the next day with, "Don't be so sensitive, Henry. It's just a job. Thought you'd need the cash." Every word was another needle digging into me. And then came the graduation fiasco. I had been working myself raw to finish my degree, juggling my job and my final projects. I didn't invite my parents because I knew they wouldn't come. Still, a small part of me hoped they might surprise me, that maybe someone would appear in the audience to see me walk across the stage. Of course, when the day came, they weren't there. Instead, I later saw pictures on social media of Emily, front row at some music festival, my parents smiling on either side of her with their arms in the air. That night, as I sat on my bed with the degree lying flat across my knees, I felt a mix of pride and bitterness so strong it made my chest ache. I had earned something huge, something they always doubted me capable of. But to them, it didn't matter, it didn't even exist. Things escalated again in the summer. I got a call from my dad, the first in nearly 8 months, and for a split second I thought maybe he was ready to apologize. Instead, he launched into a lecture about how I was hurting the family's image by distancing myself. He said, "You need to understand, Henry, Emily is accomplishing things that reflect on us. You, on the other hand, make us look like we failed as parents." I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, my jaw tight, realizing he wasn't reaching out to reconnect. He was reaching out to protect their reputation. My silence was inconvenient for them. My independence made them look bad. And Emily? She was their trophy, the gleaming example they paraded around. The last straw came in early December, just a couple of weeks before the next Christmas. Emily called me out of the blue, her voice dripping with practiced sympathy. "Henry, listen, Mom and Dad are worried about you. They think maybe you should come by for Christmas this year, just to show face. People are starting to ask questions. Not, 'We miss you.' Not, 'We're sorry.' Just a request to show face so their picture-perfect facade wouldn't crack." She even added, "You don't have to bring a gift, obviously. Maybe just try not to bring up your struggles, okay? It's supposed to be a happy day." That call didn't just hurt. It solidified everything I'd been feeling all year. I wasn't family to them. I was a prop, something to be hidden when inconvenient and pulled out when necessary. I hung up without saying a word, but deep down, something clicked into place. I realized I couldn't keep letting them control the narrative. They wanted me invisible, silent, and small. But I was no longer that kid sitting empty-handed by the Christmas tree. I wasn't ready yet to reveal what I'd been working on, not even to hint at it. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that when the time came, I'd no longer be the one in the shadows. And that time was coming faster than they realized. December had always carried a weight for me, but that particular December felt heavier than usual. The streets were strung with lights, shop windows glowed with displays of wreaths and ribbons, and every song on the radio reminded me of something I no longer had. I'd been working hard in silence all year, pouring myself into something I hadn't shared with a soul, something that had the potential to change my life. But before I could see the fruit of that work, one final knife found its way into my back, and it came from the people who were supposed to protect me. It started innocently, or at least it seemed that way. I received a letter in the mail from my bank, telling me that my account had been frozen due to suspicious activity. My chest went tight as I tore it open, my fingers shaking as I skimmed through the words. Apparently, large withdrawals had been made using my information. Nearly everything I'd saved that year, gone. I panicked. My first thought was identity theft. Maybe some stranger had gotten hold of my data. I rushed to the branch, papers clutched in my hand, only to be told after an investigation that the transactions had been made with authorization. Not mine, of course, but someone who had access to my old records. That's when it hit me. Months before, in a desperate moment, I had left some of my old financial documents at my parents' house. W-2s, tax paperwork, bank info. They'd always had a habit of snooping, but I never thought they'd actually use it against me. When I pressed harder, the bank manager told me that the login had come from my parents' home address. I don't remember walking out of the bank that day. I just remember the hollow sound of my footsteps on the pavement and the roar in my ears. They had taken what little I'd managed to build for myself. They had stolen from me, their own son, and for what? I didn't have to wait long for the answer. A few nights later, I got a call from Emily. She didn't sound ashamed or worried. She sounded smug. "Henry," she said, stretching out my name like she was scolding a child. "Mom and Dad told me you've been upset about the money. Don't be so dramatic. It went to something important." I asked her flat out what she meant, though my throat was so dry I could barely get the words out. She replied without hesitation, "My master's program tuition. They said it's fair. You weren't really using it properly anyway. You should be glad it's going towards something that matters." I swear, in that moment, something inside me broke clean in two. I had been scraping by, eating noodles, working until my bones ached just to squirrel away what little I could. And they had the audacity to take it and hand it to her, like I was just a piggy bank they could crack open when she needed more. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My voice came out flat, steady. "That was my money, Emily." She laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, come on. You act like you were going to do anything big with it. You've always been so average. Don't you think it's better that it's being invested in me? You know I'll make something of it." Those words burned more than the theft itself. She didn't even try to hide the fact that they saw me as less. That everything I earned was considered disposable if it meant fueling her rise. When I confronted my parents afterward, my mom was cold, my dad stern. My mom said, "Henry, we had to make a choice. Emily's education benefits the whole family. Your side projects aren't reliable. You'll understand when you're older." My dad added, "And don't turn this into some betrayal. We've supported you in ways you don't even realize. It's time you give something back." Supported me? I nearly laughed. They hadn't lifted a finger for me. Not once. And yet here they were, justifying stealing from their own son to prop up their daughter. The daughter who already had every advantage in the world. That night, I sat on the floor of my room staring at the empty balance in my account, the air around me colder than any winter wind. My breath came out in short bursts, my mind spinning between rage and despair. I realized then that any illusion of reconciliation was gone. If they were willing to strip me of the one thing I'd managed to claw together, there was nothing left between us. It wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. They were telling me, with every action and every word, that I didn't matter, that my work, my sweat, my sacrifices were meaningless compared to Emily's future. And yet, in that pit of hopelessness, something else stirred. Not just anger, but resolve. If they thought I was average, if they thought I would always be beneath her, if they thought I was someone they could drain dry and discard, they had underestimated me. I didn't know exactly how, not yet. But I swore in that moment that the next time they saw me, I wouldn't be the boy they dismissed. I would be someone they couldn't ignore, someone whose presence would cut through their smug smiles like glass. And as Christmas approached, I felt the storm building inside me. Something was coming. Something they wouldn't see until it was too late. After that call with Emily and the cold dismissal from my parents, I spiraled into a place I'd never been before. Rock bottom isn't a sudden crash. It's a slow sinking, like standing in quicksand while the world watches from solid ground. The first few weeks after the betrayal were some of the hardest of my life. My account had been gutted. Rent was due, my fridge was nearly empty, and I was exhausted from working every extra hour I could scrounge up. I remember one night, sitting at my rickety kitchen table in that freezing little room, eating plain rice out of a chipped bowl, wondering if this was how they pictured me. Pathetic, invisible, clinging to scraps while Emily basked in new opportunities bought with my stolen savings. Everywhere I turned, their shadow followed me. Mutual friends, classmates, even distant relatives. All of them repeated the same story I'd heard before. Your parents are so proud of Emily. She's really going places. They never asked about me. If they did, it was with a tone of pity, like I was some cautionary tale. I could see it in their eyes. Henry never really made it. I tried not to let it break me, but late at night, when the walls felt too thin and the silence too loud, I'd admit to myself that maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't cut out to shine. Maybe I was destined to always be in the background, to fade while Emily carried the family spotlight. One night in particular stands out. I had just finished a 12-hour shift, came home bone-tired, and found a letter slipped under my door. It was from my landlord, a warning notice. Rent had to be paid in full by the end of the week, or I'd be out. I sat on my mattress, no frame, just a mattress on the floor, staring at that piece of paper until my vision blurred. My body trembled, not just from fatigue, but from the crushing weight of it all. I had nothing left to give. For the first time, I thought about calling them. My parents. Just to ask why. Why take everything from me when I was barely surviving? Why give Emily more when she already had enough? But I stopped myself. I knew exactly what they would say. They would twist it into my fault. They would tell me I should have worked harder, been smarter, been more like her. And if I begged, even just for a shred of help, it would only confirm their narrative. Henry can't handle life without us. So I didn't call. I sat in the dark, letting the anger simmer beneath the despair. That anger kept me from collapsing entirely. The following days blurred together. Work, exhaustion, skipped meals, and the gnawing fear of eviction. But somewhere in the middle of all that misery, a strange thing happened: clarity. When you're stripped of everything, money, family, reputation, you start to see the world differently. I realized that my parents had already taken the worst they could from me. I was at the bottom of the well, and if I stayed there, they'd win. But if I climbed out, even if it was slow and brutal, every inch upward would be mine. I started writing. At first, it was just scribbles in an old notebook, fragments of thoughts I couldn't voice anywhere else. I wrote about the years of favoritism, about the Christmas where they said I didn't earn anything, about the way Emily had laughed when she told me my money was gone. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the bitterness poured out like poison leaving a wound. And then, as the pages filled, something shifted. The writing wasn't just venting anymore. It was shaping into something. A story, a pattern, a voice that sounded stronger than the one in my head. It gave me direction. During my shifts, I started noticing things too. Opportunities. People who had been overlooked just like me. Connections waiting to be made if I paid attention. I stopped waiting for big breaks and instead looked for cracks in the walls around me. Small ways to wedge myself in, to start building something of my own. But none of this came easily. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, nights I thought about giving up entirely. I felt the weight of loneliness like a chain around my neck. The thought of another Christmas alone gnawed at me, but worse was the thought of sitting in that living room again, empty-handed, pretending everything was fine. I promised myself I wouldn't go back. Not this year, not ever, unless I had something undeniable to show them. I wouldn't return as the invisible son. If they were going to see me again, it would be because the world saw me first. That winter, when the nights were longest and my future looked the darkest, I began laying the quiet groundwork for something bigger than I'd ever dared to imagine. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't post about it online. I just kept my head down and worked in silence, even as everyone assumed I was struggling, failing, fading away. And maybe, in a way, I was. But deep beneath that struggle, beneath the hunger and exhaustion, seeds had been planted. Seeds that would take time to grow. What I didn't know then was that those seeds, born out of betrayal and rock bottom, would eventually carry me into a spotlight so bright that even my family couldn't pretend not to see it. The winter dragged on, and I kept my head low, grinding through each day. But when the new year came, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was the exhaustion of feeling powerless. Maybe it was the anger finally cooling into something sharper, but I realized I couldn't keep living in survival mode forever. If my parents and Emily had taken everything from me, then I had nothing left to lose. That thought, strange as it sounds, gave me a kind of freedom. The notebook I'd been scribbling in became my lifeline. What started as raw venting slowly transformed into structured writing. I poured my heart into stories about family, favoritism, betrayal, and survival. At first, I didn't think much of it. I wasn't aiming for anything grand. I just needed an outlet. But the more I wrote, the more I realized I had a voice. A perspective, something people could connect to, if only they could hear it. Around that time, I stumbled onto an open mic night at a small cafe near my apartment. I didn't plan on performing. I went there because they offered free coffee to anyone who signed up. But as I sat in the back, listening to others share their poetry, songs, and monologues, something clicked. These people weren't famous. They weren't rich. But they had an audience. For the first time, I wondered, what if I could take my story, the pain I'd been carrying, and turn it into something worth listening to? The first night I read on stage, my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the paper. My voice cracked, and I thought I'd humiliate myself. But when I finished, there was silence in the room, followed by clapping, hesitant at first, then stronger. A woman came up to me afterward and said, "That felt real. Like you were telling my story too." That moment lit a fire in me. I went back the next week and the next. I kept writing, kept performing. My words sharpened, my confidence grew. Soon, people started recognizing me, asking when I'd perform again. It wasn't money yet, but it was momentum. For the first time in my life, people were seeing me, not Emily's brother, not my parents' disappointment. Just Henry. Then came a bigger break. One of the cafe regulars worked at a local radio station. After hearing me a few times, he pulled me aside and said, "You've got something, Henry. Raw, but powerful. Ever thought about recording?" I didn't even know what to say. But a week later, I found myself sitting in a tiny studio, speaking my words into a microphone instead of scribbling them into a notebook. The first recording aired late at night, a small segment most people probably missed. But a few didn't. Messages started coming in, emails from strangers who had stumbled across my piece and felt like I'd spoken directly to them. One man wrote, "You said what I could never tell my family. Thank you." A woman said, "I've been invisible my whole life too. Hearing you made me feel less alone." Those messages became my fuel. They reminded me that my pain wasn't wasted. It could be transformed into something meaningful. By spring, the station invited me back regularly. They called the segment Henry's Corner. And every week I shared a new piece, stories of growing up in the shadows, of being overlooked, of clawing out of the darkness. Each week, the audience grew. People started quoting me on social media, tagging the station, asking for more. It wasn't long before other doors opened. A small online magazine asked if I'd write a column. Then, a podcast invited me for an interview. I showed up nervous, unsure if I belonged. But when the host leaned forward mid-recording and said, "Henry, your story has power," I realized I was stepping into something bigger than I'd ever dared dream. Money started trickling in. Not much at first, but enough to make a difference. I paid my rent on time. I filled my fridge. I even bought a second-hand desk so I didn't have to write on my bed anymore. Each little upgrade felt monumental, not just because of what it was, but because I knew I had built it myself. No handouts, no favoritism, no manipulation. Just me and my words. Meanwhile, I kept tabs on my family, not out of longing, but because I needed to know. On social media, Emily posted photos of her new life. Expensive campus housing, study trips abroad, her beaming face framed by my parents' proud arms. Every caption oozed with support. Our shining star. Our future leader. The same hollow phrases I'd never heard directed at me. But this time, instead of crushing me, those images fueled me. Every smile, every caption, every reminder of how disposable they thought I was pushed me harder. I was building something real, something that couldn't be stolen. By the end of the year, my column had grown into one of the magazine's most-read features. The radio segment became primetime instead of late night. And one morning, I opened my email to find an invitation that made my hands go cold. A live television interview. National broadcast. They wanted me to share my story, my journey from invisibility to voice, with the world. I sat staring at that email for hours, my chest tight. This was it. The moment I'd promised myself when I left their house with that suitcase. I wasn't coming back as the overlooked son. I was stepping into the light on my own terms. What I didn't realize yet was just how perfectly the timing lined up. Because while my family was stringing up lights and wrapping gifts for Emily again, The date of that live interview was set for Christmas Eve, and for the first time in my life, Christmas was going to be mine. The email sat open on my screen for hours. The words, National Television Broadcast, Invitation to Speak, glowing like a beacon in the dim light of my cramped apartment. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Me? On live TV? But the more I read, the clearer it became. They weren't looking for some polished celebrity or politician. They wanted me. My voice, my story. I remember leaning back in my chair, staring at the cracked ceiling, feeling the weight of everything that had brought me here. 1 year ago, I'd been sitting in my parents' living room, empty-handed while Emily unwrapped mountains of gifts. Now, I had a chance to speak in front of millions. A chance not just to tell my story, but to control it. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about exposing everything they had tried to bury. But I couldn't rush it. Revenge, I understood now, wasn't about lashing out in the heat of anger. It was about patience, precision, setting the stage so carefully that when the curtain finally rose, there was no escape for the ones who had wronged me. Over the following weeks, the producers worked with me to prepare. They wanted me to share my journey, how I had gone from invisible to influential. I gave them drafts, stories, fragments from my notebook. Every time they read my work, their eyes lit up. This is raw. This is what people need to hear. They weren't just offering me airtime. They were offering me a spotlight I could shape however I wanted. At first, I thought about telling a sanitized version of my story. Something vague, something that wouldn't stir too much trouble. But then I remembered Emily's voice, laughing as she told me my money was better spent on her education. I remembered my father's words, accusing me of making them look like failures. I remembered that Christmas where my mom looked me in the eye and said, "You didn't earn anything." Those moments weren't vague. They were sharp, searing, unforgettable. And if I softened them, I'd be protecting the very people who had done everything to erase me. So I didn't soften them. I sharpened them. I wrote and rewrote until the words burned on the page. Meanwhile, the world around me began to shift in ways I hadn't expected. My radio segment had become so popular that local sponsors started reaching out. I got invited to small conferences, panel discussions, and podcast interviews. Each step added another layer to my reputation, another reminder that I was no longer invisible. And every opportunity, every article, every headline made it harder for my family to keep pretending I didn't exist. Then came the twist that sealed it all. A week before the live interview, I got a call from one of the producers. They said, "Henry, we'd like to make this a feature, our Christmas Eve special. We'll highlight your story, your writing, your journey. And we want to do it live." Christmas Eve, the exact night my family would be gathered around the tree again, Emily glowing in her spotlight while I was meant to be forgotten. I nearly laughed when I hung up the phone. The universe had handed me the perfect stage, but it wasn't enough just to appear. If I was going to do this, I had to make it count. I had to make sure that when my family saw me on that screen, they wouldn't just recognize me. They'd feel the ground shift beneath them. So I began preparing, not just for the interview, but for the moment itself. I practiced my words late into the night, pacing my tiny room until the floor creaked. I edited my stories to cut deep, to capture the reality of being overlooked, dismissed, stolen from. I didn't name my family outright in my drafts, but anyone who knew the truth would recognize it instantly. I wanted them squirming in their seats, forced to see themselves reflected in my words. And as I worked, something else dawned on me. For years, they had controlled the narrative, telling relatives I was irresponsible, telling neighbors I was lazy, telling themselves I was a disappointment. But now, I was about to take that power back. On live television, in front of an audience they couldn't silence, I would tell my story on my terms. The thought of it kept me going through sleepless nights. It wasn't about vengeance in the traditional sense. It was about reclamation, about making sure the truth was louder than their lies. The closer Christmas came, the more the tension built. Emily's posts flooded social media, new outfits, holiday parties, captions about family traditions. My parents commented on each one with their usual doting words. To anyone scrolling by, they looked like the perfect family. And maybe, for one more year, they would have gotten away with it. But not this year. Not with the cameras rolling. Not with the world watching. Not with me sitting in that spotlight. For the first time, I wasn't dreading Christmas. I was counting down to it. Christmas Eve arrived with a stillness I'll never forget. The city streets were dressed in glittering lights, snow dusted the sidewalks, and families bustled home with shopping bags and laughter. For most people, it was a night of comfort and tradition. For me, it was the night I had been quietly sharpening like a blade for the past year. The studio smelled faintly of coffee and electronics, wires snaking across the floor as crew members hurried to finalize last-minute checks. I sat in the green room with my notebook open on my lap, though I didn't need it anymore. Every line, every pause, every story had been etched into my mind through endless nights of rehearsal. When the producer poked her head in and said, "10 minutes, Henry," my stomach flipped, but not with fear. With anticipation. I wasn't the kid sitting empty-handed under the Christmas tree anymore. I was about to step into the light on my own terms. The set was warm with stage lights, the kind of glow that makes everything sharper. Across from me sat the host, a well-known anchor with a reputation for asking tough questions, but also for drawing out the heart of a story. The cameras were poised, the countdown began, and when the red light flicked on, the world opened its ears. The first questions were simple: how I got started, what inspired me to write. I answered calmly, measured, the same way I had practiced. But then the host leaned forward slightly and said, "You've written often about being overlooked, about being dismissed by those closest to you. Can you share what that was like?" I took a breath, my pulse pounding in my ears. This was it, the point of no return. "It's like sitting in a crowded room," I said slowly, "and realizing you're invisible to the very people who are supposed to see you most clearly. My family had a way of deciding who was worthy and who wasn't, and I was always on the wrong side of that line." The studio was silent except for my voice. I spoke about the Christmas where my parents gave every present to my sister and told me I hadn't earned anything. I described working long hours while my savings were drained to fund someone else's dreams. I painted the picture of favoritism so sharp and undeniable that anyone watching could feel the sting. But I didn't rant. I didn't cry. I kept my tone calm, steady, almost reflective. I wanted it to sound like truth, not bitterness. And it was truth. Raw, unpolished, unignorable. The host nodded, letting me continue. "What kept you going?" he asked. I looked into the camera then, straight through the lens, as if I could see into the living rooms across the country. As if I could see them, my parents, my sister, sitting around their tree like nothing had changed. "What kept me going," I said, "was the decision that I wouldn't let someone else define my worth. I may have been overlooked, dismissed, even robbed of what little I had, but I realized that as long as I still had my voice, I wasn't powerless. So I built something from that voice. And tonight, I'm not speaking as someone who is invisible. I'm speaking as someone who refuses to be erased." The words hung in the air, heavier than any ornament, brighter than any Christmas light. The interview went on, each question pulling out another piece of the story, and with each answer, I wove a thread that tied back to one undeniable truth. I had risen in spite of them. I never named my family outright, but every viewer could see the outline of the villains in my story. And the best part? They couldn't defend themselves without exposing exactly who they were. When the segment wrapped, the host leaned back and said, "Henry, thank you for sharing this. Your courage is going to resonate with a lot of people tonight." The cameras cut, the lights dimmed slightly, and applause rippled through the studio crew. My hands shook as I stood, but not from nerves. From release. From knowing that in that moment, I had taken back everything they tried to strip from me. Later, as I rode home through the snowy streets, my phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from strangers, from listeners, from people saying my story had touched them, that they saw themselves in my words. But one set of messages stood out above the rest. The family group chat was blowing up. First, a single message from Emily. "Henry, what was that?" Then from my mother. "You've humiliated us. How could you say those things on national TV?" And finally, from my father. "We need to talk." Immediately, I didn't respond. I just stared at the screen, my reflection faint in the glass. A year ago, their silence had crushed me. Now, my silence was power. And I knew deep down this was only the beginning. The hours after the interview felt surreal. I stayed up late that night in my tiny apartment, my phone buzzing relentlessly. Strangers sent me messages filled with gratitude, telling me my words gave them courage to confront their own families, their own scars. The radio station emailed me before midnight, My segment had been the most listened to of the year. And the magazine editor? She said the network had called, asking if I'd be interested in expanding my column into a book. But while the world was embracing me, my family was unraveling. The group chat blew up in waves. First came the fury, my mother's long, frantic paragraphs about how family should stay private, how I had ruined Emily's reputation. My father followed with a curt command, "You will apologize." On air. Immediately. Emily, of course, was more dramatic. "Do you know how humiliating this is for me? Everyone knows you're talking about us." Then came the bargaining. My dad called 6 times in a row. When I didn't answer, he left a voicemail, his voice calmer, even shaky. "Henry, let's not blow this out of proportion. We can fix this. Come home. Let's talk." My mom followed with her own. "Families fight, but they forgive. Don't throw this all away over misunderstandings." But it wasn't a misunderstanding. And for the first time, the balance of power had shifted. The next morning, my aunt called, one of the few relatives who had once scolded me for being irresponsible. Her voice was tight, almost angry, but not at me. "Henry, I watched your interview last night. I had no idea. None of us did. Your parents always told us you were the one who walked away, that you didn't care. But after hearing you, it all makes sense." She paused. "I'm sorry I believed them." Word spread quickly among the extended family. The lies my parents had spun for years began to collapse. People questioned why Emily had always been given everything, why I was painted as a failure when clearly I had been working, fighting, surviving. Cousins who hadn't spoken to me in years reached out with support. Uncles who once praised Emily's achievements suddenly grew quiet. The pedestal they'd built for her was starting to crack. Meanwhile, my career ignited. That live interview became a viral clip online. My words were quoted, shared, replayed across platforms. Invitations flooded in for speaking events, podcasts, collaborations. The voice they once tried to silence had become louder than anything they could control. And my family. They faced consequences they never saw coming. Emily's classmates whispered about her being the sister who took her brother's savings. Professors looked at her differently, some even asking if the story was true. My parents, once admired in their community, now received thinly veiled questions about playing favorites and supporting the wrong child. Their carefully polished image, the perfect family with the perfect daughter, was crumbling, not because I screamed, but because I spoke the truth calmly, clearly, and undeniably. Weeks passed, and the calls from them slowed. The anger gave way to silence, the silence to resignation. Eventually, my father sent one last message. "You've made your choice. Don't expect us to welcome you back." I stared at that message for a long time, then closed the chat without replying. Because here's the truth, I wasn't waiting for their welcome anymore. I wasn't that boy sitting empty-handed under the Christmas tree, desperate for scraps of validation. I had built something real, something untouchable, something mine. That Christmas, I didn't sit in a cold room with a suitcase by the door. I sat in a studio, my voice echoing into homes across the country. I sat at a desk, contracts and offers piled in front of me. I sat in the glow of a future I had carved with my own hands. And as the snow fell outside my window that night, I realized something with absolute clarity. My family hadn't just lost me. They had lost the chance to ever define me again. Final line. They once told me I hadn't earned anything. But as the world repeated my words back to me, as the spotlight finally burned bright on my face, I smiled and thought, I earned everything.